Okay, folks, I'm David Graham. I'm the professor in charge of organ here. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Madame Langlais to this concert hall. We've known each other for some years now. I had a great trip. I remember the first time I met you at the Institute of the Blind in Paris, which was totally fascinating to see how so many French organists develop their skills, really, and their understanding from that institution. So, and Madame Langlais has hosted a variety of classes for our own organ students in Paris on a number of times, so it's terrific to be able to welcome you to this hall.
Thank you.
And we look forward to your masterclass later, and we've had long chats about people we knew in common, like Rafe Downs, who designed the Organ Festival Hall, and his relationship with your husband, and it's been fascinating getting to know you and to hear the things you have had to say about a whole series of organistic events around this country and in France. So welcome to the Royal College Music Concert Hall.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Your talk. Thank you very much.
The relations between Ralph Downs and Jean Langlais ended very poorly, because the last concert he gave at the Royal Festival Hall, it was years ago, and do you hear me? Yes? For the improvisation theme, he gave to Jean Langlais the Salve Regina, Gregorian. And just before the concert, Jean Langlais said to me, well, you will have a surprise in this improvisation. Then he began very soft on the Salve Regina. And then, after a moment, came very soft, God Save the Queen. And more, he mixed the two themes and finished fortissimo, and the audience was thrilled, I can say. But when we came back to France, Jean Langlais received a terrible letter from Ralph Downs, telling it's such a shame, such a master like you used the theme of God Save the Queen. And Jean Langlais told me, I am happy because I finished my career in England with a terrible letter. You know, he had a very good sense of humor, in fact. So I am very happy to be with you. I hope you will excuse my accent, definitely French, I think. But I remember I told to my very old friend, Joël Marie Fouquet, who is the king for Franck, I told him in September, I am going to London for the symposium, and I wish to do that in English directly. So it took a little time. It was not that easy, but I know today that if I have a problem, I have a perfect help with my very good, I don't know where she is, pupil Kathleen Emerson from United States. She is in England, and she told me I will help in case. So I hope I will not have to have her help. So I brought some pictures. Do you see one? Do you see? Good. Of course, you know, everybody knows that picture. It is a painting by the French painter Jeanne Rongier in 1888. So that represents the most well-known portrait of César Franck, property of the Franck family since it has been made. Let us listen to a report by a Swiss organ pupil of Franck during the year 87-88, where he was a pupil of Franck in Paris. The name of this man was Edouard Bopp. He wrote, I heard Franck improvising at Saint-Clotilde during the 40 times I went to hear him at Saint-Clotilde. I never saw any admirers or pupils at the organ loft, with one exception. One day, arriving late at the organ loft, I was surprised to discover a painter. Jeanne Rongier was at that time 36 years old. beginning a portrait of the maître. Franck was even more surprised than I, because he said to me afterwards, "This lady wishes to paint my portrait. I don't know her. What an extraordinary idea." This portrait is magnificent. I saw it live because it is in the family since that time. It's a very big one, bigger than this, and I could see it once showed by great son of Franck, and it was absolutely beautiful. I said to him, why is this not in a museum, Musée d'Orsay, for example? And he said, no, that is in the family. It has never been repaired, never any insurance. I told him, if the house burns, what happens? But he didn't want to hear me, so, well. So you know this image, of course, but maybe you don't know this one, which is a detail of face Franck médaillon sculpted by the great French sculptor Auguste Rodin in 1893 for Franck's grave at the Montparnasse Cemetery in Paris. It's a magnificent image which shows a Franck we don't know, young. And here is the photography of this monument, this grave, and you can see the médaillon on the right. As Monsieur Chopy, the great son of Franck, said to me, this médaillon had been stolen twice because, you know, it's open to everybody. And it's a very beautiful one, but you can imagine that with Rodin, it's beautiful. Of course, then the médaillon, it's very small, shows Franck at this age. All that to say that mostly we have the César Franck image like the one painted by Jeanne Rongier in 1888, when he was 64 years old. An image of an old organist pulling the stops of his Sainte-Clotilde Cavaillé-Coll organ. An image plus all the testimonies of his many pupils, organists or not, describing a composer mostly modest, not that appreciated by his peers. Reviews of his playing often refer to this severe style of music, and as Marcel Dupré wrote in his preface to the complete Franck organ works, published by Bornemann, César Franck, who was a marvelous pianist, personally I say like Liszt, with very big hands could span the widest intervals with ease. As an organ virtuoso, he played as they played in France at that time, with approximate legato, approximate observance of length values. So, will all these assertions, all these testimonies, often contradictories, coming from his colleagues and pupils, Guillemont, Vierne, Tournemire, Marty, among others, we can assume the general title of this conference, The Mysteries of César Franck's Organ Works. First of all, César Franck personality. I would say that it may be not the one often described. He was described as a very quiet man, an old Belgian angel, as often described, severe, and praying at his organ of Sainte-Clotilde. From his family sources that I knew well, as I have been a friend of his grand-granddaughter, Henri Chopy, in the 90s. He was not that religious, considering the organ as the way to raise money as an organist. During his whole life, he tried to reach position in other important Parisian churches where they used to have a lot of services, like Saint-Roch, Saint-Eustache, Saint-Sulpice, but all the times he was unsuccessful to get the positions. Even if he tried very hard, competing, writing organ pieces for these occasions to demonstrate to the curé his competence. The only important church organ job he could attend was Saint Clotilde, because it was a new church built in the smallest parish of Paris, where there always have been very few weddings or funerals. It is still the case today. The access to the Church of Saint Clotilde, first of all as a choir master in 1857, and then 2 years later in 1959, when the organ was achieved, as the titular of the new built 40 stops clavicle organ, marked for him the beginning of his career as an organist composer, with his six pieces, composed between 1860, the prayer was the first one, to 1864, the finale. And with these 6 pieces, he could say that he was belonging to the Parisian official world of the organ. After that date, he played for each major organ dedication in Paris, recognized as an organ expert as well as a first-rank improviser, which led him in 1872 to his first official post of organ teacher at the Paris Conservatoire, after the resignation of his mentor and predecessor, François Benoît, at the age of 83. François Benoît, who taught the organ there during 52 years. That is a challenge. I could not imagine what is to teach during 52 years. Franck influence there grown up quickly, as his main purpose was to teach primarily improvisation and even composition, more than execution and interpretation. He was so successful that a large number of pupils, even not organists, came to hear his lessons, not to learn the organ technique, but to hear his improvisation lessons. These pupils, including some future important personalities of the French musical world, as Georges Bizet, not organist, or Vincent Dadi. And of course, all that provoked jealousy from his colleagues' composition teachers. But one of the mysteries which call us is the fact that even if the Saint Clotilde organ has been so important for him, 10 years after having been named there, he tried to access another position, Saint-Sulpice, in 1869 after the death of Lefebvre-Velly, but Widor got the position. The truth is probably that all his life he was searching to raise money to live, for life, multiplying private piano lessons. You must know that when he died in 1890, his succession was declared negative, and his widow was obliged to move home from Paris to her son's Georges' house in Sceaux, a suburb of Paris. She had no money. In fact, César Franck was an extremely active man, running all day long from a lesson to another, composing merely during holidays, summer holidays. Now, what are the mysteries since existing now in 2022? One of the main has been the localization of his manuscripts. He was used to make copies of all his manuscripts. Then, while he was alive, you can be sure that the final copy, having served for the publication, was a good one. It is the case for the 6 pieces, or the 3 pièces, composed in 1878, which he premiered on the big clavicle at the Trocadero Palace. The Trocadero Palace was built for the International Exposition in Paris in 1878, and for that they built a big palace. In this palace, Cavacle put a giant organ, but the acoustic was extremely bad, and that was really the problem with this organ. Poor organ, which has been first transferred to a new Trocadero Palace, then to Lyon now. I should say very changed, a lot of modifications, so you don't have the idea of how was this enormous organ. So at the Trocadero, they were organizing a big series of concerts, mainly orchestra and choirs and whatever, but also an organ series. And Franck, like Widor, they were asked to compose a piece for that. So Widor composed his Symphony No. 6 and played it, and Franck composed the Trois Pièces and played it. So Franck composed the Trois Pièces very quickly, in 4 days, between September 10th and 13th, for a concert programmed 17 days later, on October 1st, 1878. And look at that, the program he played for this big concert. He began with the fantasy of the Trois Pièces, then the Grande Pièce Symphonique from the 6 pieces, which is 25 minutes long at least. Then he improvised on French themes by Berlioz, David, and Bizet. A second part, he played the Cantabile, Trois Pièces, the Pièce Héroïque, Trois Pièces, and then improvised on Russian, Swedish, Hungarian, Irish, and English themes. Wow, that's a program, probably 2 hours long. What is important is that the manuscript on which he played for the concert was specifically intended for the big 4 manuals, new cavalical organ of the Trocadero Palace. But these Trois Pièces were printed 5 years later by Durand, and not for a big 4 manuals, but for a standard 3 manuals organ, and with important differences in the registration originally intended by Franck. Also a different end of the Pièce Héroïque. The first manuscript, called Manuscrit du Trocadero, was found by chance in 1984 in private hands after the death of a certain Madame de la Glandière, and purchased by the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Thus, even in this manuscript, you have some important differences with the published Durand. We can be sure that these differences were assumed by Franck because he corrected proofs. The case is very different with the Trois Chorales. Franck is said to have the manuscript of the third chorale in his hands when he died on November 8, 1889 in Paris. After his death, all his manuscripts went to his widow, Félicité Franck. Then after her death, not to his son, who was dead first before his mother, but to Franck's granddaughter, Thérèse, the only descendant of Franck making music. She was a piano teacher. Because Georges Franck, the elder son of Franck, who took care of the music of his father, died before his mother. In 1946 and 1947, Thérèse made an important donation of some of the organ manuscript to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, but neither of the Trois Pièces or the Trois Chorales. These last ones stayed in the family. I saw them all when in 1990 I have been invited along with Marie-Claire Alain and Xavier Darras to look at them by Mr. Henri Chopy in his Parisian apartment. There I saw the portrait. He was the only son of Thérèse Chopy Franck. Then he was the grandson of César Franck. And he was very jealous of all the manuscripts of Franck. Within 3 hours, the 3 of us have had the opportunity to look at them, but we were not authorized to copy them or take any pictures. Anyway, late, we compared our notes and arrived to the same conclusion. Franck wrote a sketch and 2 versions of each chorale, with differences between them, one being the registration, written in French and in English, and Franck didn't speak English. So for the version sent to Durand for publication, you have registration in English and French. So who selected the good version and not the 2 other, which brings some new elements? That is a mystery. Probably Georges Franck, maybe not. And with an analysis of not of the sketch, but of the 2 manuscripts, it's clear that they selected the wrong one. So this is a mystery. And who wrote in English? Mystery also. Now, in 2022, versions 2 and 3 of chorales 2 and 3 have been sold during private auctions because probably the family wanted to get some money. And we can see now how it is when they are reunited. In the recent publication of César Franck, L'intégrale de l'œuvre d'orgue, in 4 volumes by Lyrebird, Richard Brazier has made with his correspondents a tremendous work of researches, and he shows carefully all the differences between manuscripts. Imagine, for example, that we find now, today, another manuscript of Bach Passacaglia with other notes. That could be a shock. And for the Franck chorales, it's a little bit shock too. But, of course, to play a work as precisely as possible, it's better to know if there exist some fingerings by the composer, because these elements could be parts of the style of playing the words. First of all, we know that Franck had very big hands. So that is a volume of... So this is chorale number 2, manuscript. Do you see it? No. And the other one. Oh, sorry. So I show you the picture of the edition, the new edition by Lyrebird Music, which is very well done. And which is a fantastic work. So this is a picture of chorale 2 manuscript, one of the manuscript, and the same chorale, second manuscript. It's the first page, but you can see that the writing is not the same. So this is how Franck had big hands. You can see that. Incredibly big. That's a problem for interpreters with small hands. A very painful problem, I can tell you. So, fingerings. Do you see them? Okay. He wrote very few fingerings in his organ works, only for passages which seemed complicated for him. One measure in the Grande Pièce Symphonique, or one bar in a fugue of prelude, fugue, and variation, and so on. It's interesting to see that for pedal, he was alternating toe and heel at the left foot to have the right foot free to be on the swell box and make a crescendo or dynamics. These few fingerings accentuate finger slips and overlaps for the hands and show the use of, alternate toe and heel at the same foot. Many sources by Franck pupils extend the idea of a mediocre technique. Henri Busser, for example, wrote very much later about Franck's teaching. It is true to say that the teaching of technique was rather neglected, notably pedal study. Most of his lessons at the Conservatoire were devoted to plain chant and to improvise a fugue and a free theme. However, Franck knew very well the meaning of the word organist. When he wrote in January 81 in his notebook, in which he marked down comments about each of his pupils, Pianet, still too much pianist, not enough organist. I think that is interesting locution. One day, some 50 years ago, in the 70s, as I was playing a piece by Bach to Jean Langlais, who was my organ teacher, he suddenly asked me why I was using a certain fingering and not another one, as written in the Braille edition of Bach works. Franck used that fingering, he said to me, but I answered, I am playing Bach, not Franck. I know, he answered. And he told me that his Braille edition of many of Bach works has been fingered by César Franck himself in 1987 for the National Institute for Blind Youth. That was a surprise for me. I asked Langlais to give me the list of the Bach works fingered by Franck, and asked if they could be translated from Braille notation into our system. I just show you, if you can see, some of these very funny fingerings that I recopied. First of all, this is pedal fingering, voilà, of the famous fugue in D. It showed that Franck's preference was for the alternate toe heel of the same foot like Dupré did decades after. The second example in the concerto in A minor is very funny because he used to play on the on the B flat, alternance of toe, left and right on the same note. And then after alternance toe heel on the upper C. What a gymnastics. Also, Franck was proficient with finger and foot substitution, showing that he knew how to achieve absolute legato. These fingerings in Bach are very funny and really strange. I think that nobody could do that, but of course, fingerings in Bach works have probably few to see with fingerings in Franck works, as the Cavaillé-Coll organ has nothing to see with the Bach instrument. In particular, St. Clotilde Cavaillé-Coll had a swell spoon placed on the extreme right of the pedal board. Franck wanted a lot of dynamics in his music, then he probably played mostly with his left foot the notes on the pedal board and his right foot on the swell spoon, quite all the time. If it is possible, well, that is the organ of St. Clotilde. And this organ has a special specification because it was built, designed by an architect at St. Clotilde when the church was not completed. And it is extremely high, and Cavaillé-Coll complained all the time that the organ had an elevation which was not convenient for an organ. Also, it was a small organ. 46 stops is small compared to Saint-Sulpice or Notre Dame. But Cavaillé-Coll worked a lot and arrived to this extraordinary sonority, which is the one of St. Clotilde, which is not, you cannot have the same sonority on the organ Cavaillé-Coll because of how it is placed. And you can see the great division and the positive division are on the same face, which means that the positive is even bigger than the great. In fact, Cavecol built a two manuals organ, a big manual including both positive and grand orgue, and then far behind a small swell of 10 stops with a very active swell box. So, considering that he composed most of his music for this organ, you have to know it, of course. But that's too late because it has been enlarged by Tournemire in the 30s, and even more enlarged now. It's no more the organ of Franck. But of course, you have a very good testimony, which is the improvisation made by Tournemire in 1930, before having modified his organ. And in that recording, first of all, you see how Tournemire was a fabulous technician and a fabulous improviser. But you can also hear the organ and hear how active was the swell box. Alors, normally, after that, yes, that is the original console, which is now in Antwerp. It has been given by Tournemire to Flor Peters when the organ was changed, and he had no right, Tournemire, to give it to. He did that, I don't know why, because probably otherwise it should have been burned. And given to Flor Peters just after the war, transport with a military truck, American military truck, from Paris to Antwerp. And it was notified that it was a furniture. Well, it was the organ of St. Clotilde, console. You can, do you see the picture? You see it? You see there is a piece behind the pedal. And that was a place for people to go from the left side to the right side. The bench was on this piece of wood, and that disappeared. And now you see the spoon has been changed also in what we call une pédale à bascule. And you have the composition of Franck modified also, because before Tournemire, there have been two modifications, details we don't know. But at least we know one detail, which is the onda maris of positive, which was existent, see the Grande Pièce Symphonique, was transferred to the swell under the name of Voix Céleste, which is not the same. It's why the Voix Céleste has always been very, in my opinion, not right, because it's not exactly the good sonority. But one thing we don't know is if Franck, who wanted some changes just before dying, if the changes have been the indication of Franck or not. We have no papers. We are searching, but that is once more a mystery. Alors, this organ was interesting in the fact that you had 14 reeds on 46 stops, which is 1/3 of the organ, 20 foundations, 16/8/4/2, only 4 mutations, 2 plein jeu, 2 quintes. And as I told you, for the small swell, placed far behind the great and positive, a swell pedal extremely active on the sound. That you can hear of the recording of Tournemire. Also 14 pedals for the combinations, including a storm pedal on the left, but that has been changed by Tournemire also, because this organ had no swell to pedal, which was very complicated. So he offed the pedal, the storm pedal, which was something from the 19th century, you know, from Lefebvre-Velly of these improvisers, and put the grand orgue to pedal, first pedal, second positive to pedal, and third swell to pedal. But that was after Franck died. And one interesting thing also is to see that the pedal board stopped to the D and the manual to the F. And that explains why in his music sometimes you have octaves written because he had not the upper note. And for example, in the Franck prayer, he had no F sharp on the upper note. So he was obliged to write it one octave lower. And the modifications from the Trocadero manuscript for the trois pièces to the edited, also he had to think about that, because at the Trocadero he had the notes and at Saint Clotilde no. And this detail is very interesting to think about Tournemire improvisation in Victime Pascali Laudes. There is a very difficult pedal solo which goes up than the D, and which proves that he played that on the manual, probably in octave. So sometimes the organ drives the composer to solutions which he didn't want. Alors, César Franck created a new way of composition for organ. Before him, the composers were used to make dynamics by changing manuals. You played on the great, then softer on the positive, then on the swell, etc. But Franck was a demonstrator at the Clavier-École factory when he was young. So he experimented the way to transform the organ in a kind of big piano with a lot of dynamics, in putting all foundations, and on the swell, putting the oboe and the trumpet, which were very soft, and coupling. So when he played the grand orgue with the swell box closed, you could not hear the reeds. They were absolutely too soft. And by opening the box more and more, the sound arrived into a big sound. So it was a way to make dynamics on a manual on an organ, which was completely new. Alors, another problem, another mystery, is the tempi. Until 1999 and the publication of the book titled César Franck, fabulous book by Joël-Marie Fauquet, the book of reference in French, it was admitted that Franck did not indicate any metronomic tempo in his organ works, either in manuscripts or in published scores. But in his book, Fauquet gave a list of tempi noted by Franck is in his exemplar of the edition Mayence Couvreur of his 6 pieces. It was his personal exemplar. These tempi seemed so fast that most of the organists doubted of their veracity, mainly because they are all 1/3 faster than the ones generally admitted by everybody following various traditions since Franck's death. But to confirm this very fast tempi, a second event appeared in 2003 with so 4 years after Fauquet book, in the September issue of the American Organist, with an article by American musicologist Rollin Smith, who related the discovery by chance of letters by Franck to an American organist, pupil of his, especially this letter dated December 31, 1887, where Franck carefully wrote the tempi of his 6 pieces, probably to respond to the request of this young organist, who has been the only American pupil of Franck. The tempi are exactly similar to the ones described by Fouquet, and more, Franck added some details about the Trois Pièces of 1878. For the number 1, Fantasy in A, much fantasy in interpretation, that's all. For second, Cantabile, quarter note, 92. And for the pièce héroïque, quarter note, 104. These last tempi are much faster than the ones generally admitted. So this is a fragment of this letter, very interesting. The organist could not believe to this very fast tempi, and many said that they were just not possible to use, as they destroyed the image of César Franck, severe and calm, transmitted by his pupils and friends. Some critics even say that probably Franck could not read correctly his metronome, which is absolutely stupid, but well. In fact, Franck has been all his life an extremely busy man, as I told you, with activity divided between his teaching, the organ class at the Conservatoire, giving private piano lessons to a lot of pupils, composing symphonic poems, operas, melodies, chamber and piano music, books for the harmonium, playing for many organ dedications, expertise of new organs, having his service at Sainte-Clotilde, and so on. Gabriel Piernet, his longtime pupil and successor at Sainte-Clotilde, had a lot of reminiscences about Franck, and he said, his lessons were so numerous that he did not know how to schedule them. Thus, I took mine at 6 o'clock in the morning at his home. The servants were still asleep, and Mrs. Franck came to open the door. All during my lesson, Franck took his café au lait and was so alert that I invited him. César Franck was a piano virtuoso. That is absolutely clear. Exactly as was Liszt. Why then to think that he could not play fast his music, composed not at Sainte-Clotilde, but in his music room at home with a dry acoustic? So the tempi are one of the many mysteries, and it is not a small mystery. As I would like to show you, these pieces sound completely differently faster. And it is very much easier to make a rubato fast than slowly, even it seems shocking. I would like to finish to cite the locution of Adolphe Marty, one of the first prizes of the organ class of Franck, also a blind organist. He was one of the Jean Langlais mentor and his predecessor at the organ class of the National Institute for the Blind in Paris. And he said many times to Langlais, who liked to cite this locution to his many students, we have no idea of how freely Franck played his own works. Step by step, we are rediscovering Franck's organ music and a better way to approach it, but some manuscripts are still missing, so we can consider that the researches are not yet finished. A last photo, maybe I will show it to you. Do you see it? Taken just after the big storm in Paris on December 26, 1999, the day after Christmas. Only one statue in Paris has been destroyed, the one of César Franck, sitting on his organ bench at Sainte-Clotilde. I took this photo, and in my opinion, it looks very tragic. It was to take a photo. So I tried to give you some information of these mysteries. And believe me, I am on this problem since the year I came first at Sainte-Clotilde in 1967. And I never gave up. And probably I will have other things to discover, and that's great, because Franck is a real mystery, And the mystery also is that his music for him and his wife and his son Georges was a music of operas, big oratorios, big things. He wanted eagerly to be recognized as an opera musician, and Georges wanted his father to be the French Wagner, which is not the case, of course. But what Georges Franck just did not want was the fact that Franck is considered as a great master of organ. And a funny anecdote is that when they did this statue of Franck just by Saint-Clotilde Square, Franck sitting on the bench at the organ, he was against this idea completely. He said, but no, like that, people will consider that he's an organist. And it is also why, for him, the small pieces for organ composed by Franck when he just before he arrived at Saint-Clotilde and the organ was there, he composed small pieces to play at the church when the organ was not there. And at that church, Cavaillé-Coll put a small organ, and that is a piece. These are pieces for organ, not for harmonium. But Georges considered they were too small, not interesting, so he said they are for harmonium. So the problem of the family is real, because Georges wanted to change the image of his father, and the descendant wanted to keep everything with them. And of course, it's not a good idea. Everything should be at the Bibliothèque Nationale or anywhere else, and should be shown to everybody, of course. So that are my ideas. If you have any questions, I would be happy to answer.